Why do wars in the Middle East make everyday life more expensive, even for people living thousands of miles away? At first, that idea sounds strange. After all, when most people hear about conflict in that region, they think about politics, military tensions, or international diplomacy. Headlines talk about missiles, negotiations, and global leaders meeting behind closed doors. But very few people connect those events to something as ordinary as the price of milk at the grocery store, the cost of filling up a car, or the interest rate on a home loan. Yet history shows something surprising. Conflicts and political tensions in the Middle East have repeatedly triggered waves of inflation across the global economy. And the reason comes down to one resource that modern civilization depends on more than almost anything else: oil. Oil is not just another commodity traded on financial markets. It's the fuel that powers the entire economic machine. It runs the trucks that deliver food to supermarkets. It fuels the airplanes that connect global trade. It powers cargo ships transporting products across oceans. Factories rely on it to manufacture goods. Farmers depend on it to grow crops. Even the packaging used for everyday products often contains petroleum-based materials. In other words, oil is deeply embedded in almost everything we buy. And when the price of oil rises, something else usually follows: inflation. Transportation becomes more expensive. Manufacturing costs increase. Shipping prices climb. Businesses across the world then face a difficult decision. They can either absorb those higher costs or pass them on to consumers. Most choose the second option, which means the price increases eventually reach ordinary people at the gas pump, at the grocery store, on electricity bills, and sometimes even in mortgage payments. But here's the question most people rarely ask. How can a conflict in one region of the world trigger higher prices across the entire global economy? Why do financial markets react so quickly to geopolitical tensions in the Middle East? And why do economists and investors pay such close attention to events happening there? To answer those questions, we need to understand how the global energy system actually works and why one narrow shipping lane has the power to shake the entire world economy. To understand why conflicts in the Middle East affect the entire global economy, we first need to understand something simple but powerful. Not all oil-producing regions are equal. The Middle East is not just another place where oil happens to exist. It is the single most important center of global energy supply. Several countries in this region hold some of the largest oil reserves on Earth. Saudi Arabia alone sits on hundreds of billions of barrels of proven reserves. Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran also rank among the most resource-rich energy producers in the world. Together, these countries produce roughly 1/3 of the world's total oil supply. That means millions of barrels of oil leave the Middle East every single day. Those barrels travel thousands of miles to power cars in Europe, factories in Asia, airplanes in North America, and industries across the developing world. But there's another reason this region is so critical: geography. Much of the world's oil must travel through a narrow waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. This passage is called the Strait of Hormuz, and it is one of the most strategically important locations on the entire planet. Nearly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through this single shipping lane. To visualize that, imagine if one highway carried 1/5 of all the trucks delivering food to every supermarket in your country. If that highway suddenly closed, even for a short period of time, panic would spread across supply chains almost immediately. Supermarkets would worry about shortages. Transportation companies would scramble to find alternative routes. Prices would start rising quickly. That's exactly how global oil markets react to instability near the Strait of Hormuz. Even the threat of disruption can send energy prices soaring. Because when it comes to oil, supply interruptions don't just affect one country. They affect the entire world. Traders, investors, and governments understand this very well. And that's why financial markets pay such close attention to tensions in the Middle East. When instability increases in that region, markets begin asking a critical question. What happens if the flow of oil slows down? Because if that flow is interrupted even slightly, the ripple effects can spread through the global economy faster than most people realize. Oil markets are some of the fastest reacting markets in the entire global economy. Unlike many industries where supply can gradually adjust over time, the modern world depends on a constant, uninterrupted flow of oil. Every day, millions of barrels must move from producers to refineries, from refineries to fuel distributors, and from there to businesses and consumers. That system works smoothly most of the time. But when conflict begins in a major oil-producing region, everything changes. The first reaction doesn't usually come from governments or energy companies. It comes from financial markets. Within minutes of major geopolitical news, oil traders around the world begin asking a series of urgent questions. Will oil production be interrupted? Could pipelines be damaged? Will shipping routes become unsafe? Could sanctions prevent certain countries from exporting oil? Even if none of those things have happened yet, the mere possibility can move markets dramatically. And this happens because oil markets respond not just to reality, but to expectations about the future. Imagine you're a trader responsible for supplying fuel to airlines or transportation companies. If you believe oil prices might surge next week due to a potential conflict, you would probably try to buy oil contracts immediately before prices rise. Now imagine thousands of traders thinking the same way at the exact same time. Suddenly, demand for oil contracts surges. That surge pushes prices higher almost instantly. Sometimes prices jump before any real shortage has even occurred. In other words, fear alone can move billions of dollars in global markets. History shows this pattern again and again. During periods of tension in the Persian Gulf, rumors of military escalation have caused oil futures to spike within hours. Investors understand that energy supply chains are fragile, and they know that even small disruptions can ripple through the global economy. So markets move fast, often faster than the actual events themselves. And once oil prices start rising, the effects rarely stay contained within the energy sector. Because oil is not just another commodity, it is the foundation of transportation, manufacturing, and global trade. Which means when its price begins to climb, a much larger economic chain reaction is about to begin. Once oil prices begin rising, the effects don't stay confined to energy markets for very long. They spread outward, step by step, through the entire global economy. The first place this impact usually appears is transportation. Think about something simple: a delivery truck bringing bread from a bakery to a supermarket. That truck runs on diesel fuel. If diesel prices suddenly jump by 30 or 40%, the cost of delivering that bread immediately becomes more expensive. Now multiply that by millions. Millions of trucks delivering groceries. Millions of cargo ships transporting goods across oceans. Thousands of airplanes carrying products between continents. Rail systems moving raw materials between cities. Fuel powers almost every step of modern logistics. And when oil becomes more expensive, the cost of moving goods rises everywhere. Almost every product you buy travels through a long supply chain before reaching your hands. Food moves from farms to warehouses to grocery stores. Clothing moves from factories to distribution centers to retail shelves. Electronics travel across oceans before appearing in stores. Furniture moves through trucking networks before reaching showrooms. Every link in that chain relies on fuel. When oil prices rise, transportation companies face higher operating costs almost immediately. Shipping companies must pay more for bunker fuel. Airlines must pay more for jet fuel. Truck fleets must pay more for diesel. And those businesses eventually face a difficult decision. They can either absorb the higher costs and reduce their profits, or pass those costs on to customers. In most cases, they choose the second option, which means manufacturers start paying more to ship their products. Retailers start paying more to stock their shelves. Distributors start paying more to move inventory. And gradually, those higher costs work their way through the system until eventually they reach the final step in the supply chain, the consumer. That's why when oil prices spike, people often notice the first impact at the gas pump. But the second wave comes quietly afterward. Groceries become more expensive. Online shopping deliveries cost more. Airline tickets rise. Even everyday household items start creeping up in price. What started as a change in crude oil markets slowly transforms into something much broader, a global increase in the cost of living. Most people think oil mainly affects gasoline prices, but the reality is far bigger. Oil is not just a fuel for cars and trucks. It is also a critical ingredient in the manufacturing of countless products used in everyday life. In fact, petroleum sits quietly at the foundation of many industries people rarely associate with energy. Take plastics, for example. Plastic is one of the most widely used materials in the modern world. It appears in food packaging, electronics, medical equipment, water bottles, toys, and thousands of other products. And most plastics are made from petrochemicals derived from oil. When oil prices rise, the cost of producing those materials often rises too. The same applies to chemicals used across industries, from fertilizers to synthetic fibers. Which brings us to another major sector heavily dependent on energy: agriculture. Modern farming is far more energy-intensive than many people realize. Large tractors, irrigation systems, and harvesting machines all run on diesel fuel. Fertilizers, which help increase crop yields, are produced using large amounts of energy, often derived from natural gas. Transportation also plays a major role in food production. Crops must be transported from farms to processing facilities, then to warehouses, and finally to supermarkets. Each step requires fuel. When energy prices rise, farmers and food producers face higher operating costs. Those costs eventually show up in grocery store prices. Even industries that seem unrelated to oil feel the impact. Clothing manufacturers rely heavily on synthetic fabrics like polyester, nylon, and acrylic, all derived from petrochemicals from oil. Electronics manufacturers use plastics and petrochemical components in circuit boards, insulation materials, and device casings. Packaging companies produce millions of cardboard boxes and plastic materials used for shipping products worldwide. In other words, energy is deeply woven into the structure of the global economy. When oil prices rise, it's not just transportation costs that increase. Production costs rise. Manufacturing becomes more expensive. Agriculture becomes more expensive. Shipping becomes more expensive. And businesses across multiple industries face the same difficult choice: absorb the rising costs or pass them along to consumers. Most choose the second option, which means higher energy prices rarely stay confined to the energy sector. They quietly ripple outward through almost every part of the economy, and eventually those ripples reach households everywhere. If this relationship between Middle Eastern conflicts and global inflation sounds theoretical, history provides several clear examples showing exactly how it works. One of the most dramatic moments occurred in 1973 during the Arab-Israeli conflict known as the Yom Kippur War. At the time, several major oil-producing nations in the Middle East decided to take a political step that would shock the global economy. Members of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, often known as OPEC, restricted oil exports to countries that supported Israel during the conflict. The effect was immediate. Global oil supply tightened almost overnight. And oil prices didn't just rise slightly, they exploded. Within months, the price of crude oil nearly quadrupled. For economies that relied heavily on imported energy, the shock was enormous. Gasoline shortages appeared in multiple countries. Long lines formed at fuel stations as drivers waited hours just to fill their tanks. Some governments even introduced rationing programs, limiting how much fuel people could buy. But the impact didn't stop at the gas pump. Transportation costs surged, manufacturing expenses climbed, farmers paid more for fuel and fertilizer, food prices started rising. The entire global economy began feeling the pressure. This period eventually became known as the 1973 oil crisis, and it triggered one of the most difficult economic environments many developed countries had faced in decades. Inflation surged, economic growth slowed, unemployment rose in several major economies. Central banks found themselves trapped in a difficult situation. If they raised interest rates to fight inflation, they risked pushing economies into recession. If they kept rates low, inflation could spiral out of control. This combination of slow economic growth and high inflation became known as stagflation, a rare and painful economic condition. And it taught governments, economists, and investors an important lesson. Energy markets and geopolitical stability are deeply connected. When major oil-producing regions become unstable, the ripple effects rarely stay contained within the energy sector. They spread through transportation, food production, manufacturing, and global trade, eventually reaching households across the world. History shows that even a conflict happening thousands of miles away can quietly reshape the economic reality of everyday life. Fast forward to today, and the global economy is even more interconnected than it was during the 1970s. Supply chains now stretch across continents in ways that would have seemed impossible just a few decades ago. A single product, like a smartphone, might rely on raw materials from Africa, components manufactured in Asia, assembly in another country, and distribution to consumers worldwide. Every step of that process requires energy, and most of that energy still comes from oil and petroleum-based products. Shipping products across oceans requires massive cargo vessels powered by fuel. Transporting goods inland requires fleets of trucks and trains. Factories need electricity and fuel to operate machinery. Even service industries like airlines, logistics companies, and hotels depend heavily on energy inputs to operate efficiently. When oil prices rise, the cost of producing and moving goods increases throughout these interconnected networks. That means that even small disruptions in oil supply can have outsized effects on costs everywhere. Take airlines, for example. Jet fuel often accounts for a large portion of operating costs. When fuel prices spike, ticket prices usually follow. That, in turn, affects tourism, hospitality, and business travel, demonstrating how energy price changes ripple far beyond the energy sector itself. Similarly, consider manufacturing. Modern factories often rely on oil-derived chemicals, plastics, and synthetic materials. Rising oil prices increase production costs for these inputs, and manufacturers usually pass those costs on to consumers. The result is that higher energy prices gradually appear in everything from clothing to electronics. Agriculture remains extremely energy dependent as well. Diesel-powered tractors, irrigation pumps, fertilizers, and transport all rely on oil or natural gas. When energy costs rise, the cost of producing and delivering food increases, which is eventually reflected in grocery bills. And it's not just goods that are affected. Financial markets, interest rates, and consumer spending patterns are influenced as well. When oil prices climb, investors anticipate rising inflation. Central banks may respond by adjusting interest rates, affecting mortgages, loans, and credit cards. Suddenly, energy price changes are shaping the entire financial system, not just gas stations or grocery stores. In short, the modern global economy is a tightly woven web, with oil acting as one of its central threads. A disruption in supply from the Middle East can propagate quickly, touching nearly every sector and every consumer. This interconnectedness explains why investors, economists, and policymakers watch the Middle East so closely. Small changes in geopolitical tensions there can translate into large economic consequences worldwide. When we step back and look at the bigger picture, the connection becomes crystal clear. A conflict in the Middle East may begin as a geopolitical event, missiles fired, tanks mobilized, or political tensions rising. But its economic consequences rarely stay confined to that region. Oil markets act like a global heartbeat, sending signals through industries, supply chains, and financial systems worldwide. When the flow of oil becomes uncertain, prices rise, and those higher prices ripple outward, increasing transportation costs, manufacturing expenses, and food production costs. Businesses pass these costs along to consumers, creating a quiet but powerful inflationary wave. Central banks respond too. When inflation spikes, they may raise interest rates, impacting mortgages, loans, and credit cards. Suddenly, a war thousands of miles away influences your grocery bill, your electricity costs, your flight ticket, and even your monthly mortgage payment. Even as renewable energy grows, oil remains deeply embedded in the global economy. Modern infrastructure, supply chains, and manufacturing processes are built around petroleum. Transitioning away from it is a multi-decade process. For now, energy from oil is still a central driver of global prices. The takeaway is simple but profound. The global economy is deeply interconnected. Local events in a critical oil-producing region can quietly but powerfully affect everyday life across the planet. So, the next time you notice rising prices at the gas pump, higher grocery bills, or increased electricity costs, remember something important. These aren't just random fluctuations. They're a part of a chain reaction set off by the delicate balance of energy supply, global markets, and geopolitical events. In the end, understanding this connection isn't just about economics. It's about awareness. It's about recognizing that in a globalized world, distant events can touch your life in ways most people never realize. And that's why when oil prices move, the entire world tends to feel it.